Hello, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us this year at the meeting on the Mesa. We look forward to having the chance to talk to you for a few minutes about the things that are going on at CBER that affect the cell and gene therapy sector. Welcome.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So, Peter, a year ago when we had a similar conversation, you were spending on the order of 3/4 of your time on COVID-related work and about a quarter of your time, according to your report, on cell and gene therapy matters, which I think you described as being kind of a happy respite from the demands of COVID at that time. Can you give us a feel, since obviously we've made incredible progress with COVID vaccines, but there are remaining issues there on the vaccine side of your portfolio. Can you give us a feel for what your current distribution of time is?
It's probably not too far off. It's from where it was, and that's due to the fact that as the group of COVID-19 vaccines came along for emergency use authorization, the population subsequently had to be broadened. So now we're dealing with not just emergency use authorized vaccines for adults. We're dealing with them potentially for adolescents and children. We're dealing with biologics license applications for those vaccines that were given emergency use authorization. We're dealing with booster vaccines for those authorized and approved vaccines. And we're dealing with additional vaccines that may come in under emergency use or biologics license applications. And with some transition in our Office of Vaccines, it's going to require some additional concentration and focus. So I'd probably say between 2/3 and 3/4 of my time is being spent on vaccines related issues, as probably well it should, because despite the fact that we've made a lot of progress, we still have a long way to go to bring the COVID-19 pandemic to an end in the United States.
Yes. Well, thank you for your efforts in that regard. I know that obviously there were recent developments there, and there will continue to be, but we're grateful for your efforts on that side of your portfolio as well as ours. You had mentioned last year also, though, that CBER was already stretched thin even before the pandemic hit. And now, obviously, the PDUFA 7 agreement, which was recently made public, indicates that there's a agreement among the negotiators that CBER needs a lot more personnel, and the agreement would give you a number of additional full-time employees. Can you talk a bit more about the PDUFA agreement and what you think are the most important aspects of it beyond personnel additions?
I think for me, a lot of this, it's unfortunately personnel happen to be the major issue for our Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapy. But the other issues, it's very helpful to be able to have the support for modernization of our business processes and our information technology infrastructure within the center. Some of our systems are so rusty that they're corroded at this point. They need to be replaced. There has to be a harmonization across the center in terms of our business processes, so we actually can be more efficient and we can leverage more. So those are things I'm quite appreciative of. Plus all of the things that I think are going around the PDUFA 7 negotiations, which are essentially augmenting where we were headed anyway, with kind of patient-focused drug development and model-informed drug development, continuing to move those things forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, the first year, the personnel additions are really front-loaded in year one, and you've got something like 130 additional FTEs in year one. Obviously, one of the big challenges in this sector right now is recruiting. No matter whether you're at the FDA, you're at ARM, or you're in an ARM member organization. So How do you propose to
Yeah, yeah.
attract 130 people in 1 year?
So we're not waiting for we're not waiting for PDUFA anyway. We're starting right now to try to staff up because it's kind of urgent that we start to deal with this. Um, but we'll take advantage of any number of things. First of all, the good news is gene therapy is an exciting area. It inherently of interest. And so that's a good thing to be starting off with. I do think we'll take some of the learning from the pandemic so that we will be able to leverage people working off site. I think that's kind of a breakthrough barrier that we've seen, right? We used to be very much people had to be at FDA,
Mhm.
located on site or on site at least most of the time. And I think in this area of gene therapy, um, if we can get good people, particularly good experienced people that are going to be working remotely, we'll take it because otherwise we're going to be at a disadvantage compared to other entities. Because I think this is the major transformation. I don't think actually corporate America has understood how much the world has changed. I don't think we have. Maybe I'm wrong. That I think that that the world has changed so dramatically that a year from now, when we really hopefully the pandemic is fading into memory after a wonderful summer, and we're back at work, it's not going to look like work looked like in fall of 2019.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, Last fall, you started a series of listening sessions with ARM and other organizations about kind of how things were going at CBER. And obviously the conversations with ARM were particularly around how things were going in the cell, gene, and tissue space. Can you talk to me about your takeaways or the findings, conclusions of those listening sessions, and if they're going to
Yeah.
affect things at CBER going forward?
So yeah, they do. And I think different people took different things away from those sessions, but I will tell you at least my take from them.
Mhm.
Um, my take from them was that uh, the the industry, the field needs consistency. They need us to be consistent with the advice we give, whether that's on chemistry manufacturing controls or on clinical trials. They need consistency across the different review teams, telling them things so that um, there's consistency across a given uh, product area and consistency across different products within that area. So that kind of consistency is one thing I heard. The other thing I heard very much was the need for timeliness. Now, obviously, when we're understaffed, that's a problem, but our folks have really heard that, and we're currently working on kind of triage processes because it's clear that in some cases, just first in, first out isn't the best way to handle this because some things that come in are so critical to a development plan compared to others that just kind of doing it first in, first out doesn't do justice to patient care ultimately.
Mhm.
So that's something we're just going to have to work through, I think.
Mhm.
So those were of the two large things. Those were really, to me, kind of key topics there about how we operate. There were some other more minor things about kind of our business processes, getting that consistency there. Um, and those to me are things that are lower hanging fruit because they can those can be fixed and we have consultants helping us fix them. But if we can't get to this review consistency um, uh, and the timeliness, that's really important. And then finally, I will say one other thing that um, I hear at least. I'm not sure whether everyone else heard, but I heard what they really, it's very important that the way I lean in when we're talking in a meeting like this filters down into the organization to the way the organization leans in to developing gene therapies. And for me, that's a really important thing to have happen over the next few years to really be leaning in to taking measured chances. Obviously, safety and effectiveness is what we have to do, but to lean in an area where there is always going to be some more uncertainty, perhaps than we've been used to in the past.
Mhm, mhm. Well, that's a good segue. I wanted to ask you, speaking of safety and effectiveness, about the recent AdCom meeting on AAV safety, and whether you learned anything new in that session, and what we can expect from the agency following that in-depth conversation.
Yeah, so thanks. It's a good question, and we're still sorting through a lot of very helpful information that came from that meeting. Um, I think there was a breadth of information that was presented that was very helpful. I think some of the information on neurotoxicity, some of the information on hepatotoxicity, um, just interesting to have all collected together. Um, and we'll sort through it. I think it may help us develop some principles moving forward for what populations we're comfortable seeing certain products studied in, what populations to avoid perhaps early on. If there are certain ways we think that products can be developed, or that certain products that we need to see developed, or vectors that we see need to be developed to avoid some of these toxicities.
Mhm.
But my takeaway really was not that there was anything horrible going on here with these different aspects, but really that this is just a field that's maturing, that we're actually using these things enough now so that we're seeing what's normal with any kind of drug or biologic, which we're seeing side effects.
Mhm.
And we have to manage through those and mitigate them to the greatest extent possible. And the fact that we're seeing them just means that we're actually like being able to deploy these now, right? We're actually seeing gene therapies being used. We're seeing people butting up against some challenges. Some are ones that can be overcome, some may be insurmountable, but then we will kind of redefine what the landscape has to look like and move ahead. So I don't view that meeting as discouraging at all. I view it as part of what gene therapy is going to be doing in terms of growing over the coming years. Um, and probably, if there's one thing coming out for me, it's that probably, you know, we need to work around and do our best with the AAVs, but we probably shouldn't be totally forgetting that there are other vectors besides AAV and other non-viral mechanisms that we
Mhm.
probably need to be thinking about for the future as we want to deal with things. Because even though they're high risk in that we don't know that they'll work out, there's potentially high reward at the ability of being able to potentially redose something, for example, in a more easy manner than we can do right now with AAV. I mean, obviously, people are working with less immunogenic AAVs to try to make that possible. But you could imagine that if you had something that could be redosed every few years more easily, there would be less of a there would be less of some of the challenge that we're having now. Also, if there were less of some of the side effects due to inflammation, there might be issues. So I think these are all things that we have to work through, but it's a good problem to have because it says that we're actually like doing gene therapy and not just talking about it.
Yeah. Some of the issues that came up there were around kind of inconsistent or non-standard measurement of certain aspects of AAV, and there was a lot of discussion around empty capsids and both sort of measurement and reporting of those of empties. do you see the agency taking further steps either to require more reporting in those domains or to try to drive a standard measurement in this space?
Yeah, I'd say probably without making any commitments, probably the first step is going to be to try to have some consensus building,
Mhm,
potentially workshops, some things like this,
mhm,
to try to continue moving where we've been trying to move in getting people to come together to figure out how to do this and how to do the analytics in a reproducible manner. And then
mhm,
this concept of, I mean, I've heard, mean, it was actually interesting at the meeting. There were different opinions about the meaning of empty capsids and how bad or good they might be. Um, so I think we probably will need to develop some more consensus there um, on this, and that's something that I think when we have the right time to be able to work, uh, it's a good thing that we be able to do here. You know, I think dictating something from the agency when we don't have a really firm grasp on the science that we're looking at is generally something to be avoided. It's usually when we get the most criticism back at us. So
mhm.
gently getting there, on the other hand, with consensus building might be a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We talked about CMC a lot last year, and obviously there had been at that point a number of programs that have been delayed for CMC issues, and we certainly haven't kind of solved the CMC challenges in the last 12 months, but we've made some progress. And I wondered whether you see it that way, whether you see we've made some progress in terms of what you're getting at the agency. And also whether you could speak to the CMC pilot project in PDUFA 7 and what in your mind, if you've had a chance to think about it, kind of that ideal pilot might look like that could really help advance the the field for for the benefit of regulators and sponsors.
Uh, great question. So I do think we've seen progress. I mean, I think we're seeing companies now that are making gene therapies with reproducible from batch to batches. Um, I think there's um, the quality of manufacturing and characterization has improved significantly, and you can tell that because there are bunches of people who get into rooms now and talk about the analytics and actually are talking about empty capsid percentages and what methods are going to be used to determine that, et cetera. So I think there's been a fair amount of progress, even though we probably are not at the point of perfection. I do think the issue for manufacturing um, continues to be one of capacity. I think continues to be one of challenges of not actually having adequate contract manufacturing capacity. That's just, again, from my just look at the field, quite a few commercial sponsors note that they end up they would prefer to use a contract manufacturer because they can't find one that can take on their work in the next year.
Mhm.
They're obligated to set up their own manufacturing. And then you have the academics who struggle the same way. So not having adequate commercial manufacturing capacity, contract manufacturing capacity
Mhm.
is something that I think is challenging. And I think it actually is I think it does have a challenging effect on the whole field because it makes for rebuilding manufacturing capacity when you don't necessarily know that you're going to have the need for that long term. So there are probably a lot of bioreactors that are going to be bought that may never see a commercial product made in them, but that's just the way it is. Um, so that's that piece of it. And then the pilot project, I think the goal here is, look, this is again it's more of a personal opinion of how I think of gene therapies, but I have to think of gene therapies a bit like there is this device-like element of them. The device-like element is that the vector is really a physical thing. It does have biologic. Don't get me wrong; it's got biologic activity. I'm not trying to say that, but it is
Mhm,
serving as a carrier um,
mhm,
for the insert in gene therapy. And obviously, one can only manipulate that vector so much before you do develop different biologic properties. But if you can determine what size inserts you can put in that vector, such that there really isn't a change in the biologic properties of the vector itself. Obviously, the
mhm.
insert's going to have different biologic properties. Um, the idea would be, could we show ways that sponsors could have an easier time moving from one product to the next? Or if one had a portfolio, ultimately you'd like to see that gene therapy companies might have, a company might have, I don't know, 20 products being made for 50 doses a year, just hypothetical,
Yep.
right? And if we're using the same type of leveraging approach and they decided, oh, wow, we found a new process whereby we tweak, we swap out to a new serum-free process that's a tweak on our old one, and they demonstrated that well with one of the products. You'd like to have it be able to cascade, because if they're all in the same family, why, instead of having to do it 20 times, doing it once would actually then make it financially viable to produce these products.
Mhm.
Um, and you have a financially viable model potentially, because I don't think that a nonprofit model is going to actually, I mean, this is just, again, my personal opinion, not those of the United States government. um, I'm not sure that a nonprofit model is going to get us there, in the kind of equity, the quality of across disease entities that you'd like to see,
Mhm.
that I think a commercial model might actually get us to. So that's the idea here, is to make a commercial model that can work.
Well, I know you're joining Bob Smith from Pfizer and some folks from FNIH to talk a bit more about the bespoke gene therapy program that you've had a lot of a big role in driving at the FNIH. So I'll leave follow-up questions. And for people who are interested in kind of understanding more about some efforts to really figure out how do we get gene therapies produced and delivered for ultra rare indications that at least at the moment aren't commercially viable, and what kind of work is going on in that sector, tune in to that session here at the meeting. I'd like to ask a question about something else that you and I have spoken about a little bit in the past, which is that there are a number of efforts and proposals out there for centers of excellence at the agency, most of which are modeled after the Oncology Center of Excellence. And there's some thinking about this for rare disease, but there are kind of other center of excellence ideas floating around. So I want to ask you, from your perspective, what are the pros and cons of the center of excellence structure as a means to get better focus and coordination across the agency in a particular therapeutic area?
Yeah, so centers of excellence they definitely have their pros and their cons. And the pro for look, the oncology, Rick Pazzer has done an incredible job with the Oncology Center for Excellence. He's managed to make a center where there's a certain academic nature to it. It's got cohesiveness. It's focused around cancer, right? It's got a unifying principle. There's a certain urgency because cancers tend to kill people. That they are constantly trying to push the envelope, get products to market. The folks that are there have that urgency. They have a focus there, and I think that's been very helpful. Um, the downside sometimes to this is that if you have an area that's very complicated, where manufacturing is a very important part of the process, it they don't have to worry about that a lot in the Oncology Center of Excellence because it's not an issue.
Yeah.
Monoclonals, the protein-based therapies, those are handled by a different part of the organization. For us, where you have products where the manufacturing aspect of this can be very challenging. Quality control, those aspects are very important. Where the product is so complicated that you need these multidisciplinary teams of people from CMC and clinical to work together. There's something to be said for the way we're working on it through, our Office of Tissues Advanced Therapies, where you have that kind of integrated process. The other issue is if you start going too far on the center of excellence concept, where do you stop, right? Because I mean, if you start saying, well, these reviewers work on this, these reviewers work on that, it can get hard to actually get our work done because many of the applications at the end of the day in gene therapy, it's the vector, right? It's the clinical part is important, don't get me wrong, but the CMC aspects are extremely important. And so I think there's risk benefit to each of these. Now, the center's concept also works when you have a very small thing that you're biting off, such as the Center for Manufacturing Excellence that CBER and CDER are working together on for advanced manufacturing technologies, because there again, it's kind of narrow focus chunk to take off on. But I take people's point. So Office of Rare Diseases, there's so many different areas of clinical expertise necessary there. So what would you do? You'd bring back, you might lose efficiency, because then would you consult out to different parts of the agency? My experience at the agency is when we have to consult out, that's the least efficient part of things. So balancing here, one can no doubt say though that, look, again, to conclude, Oncology Center of Excellence, stellar success. Another success, for instance, this advanced manufacturing, the manufacturing initiative, CBER, CDER. Some of these others, I think, it has to be done on a case-by-case basis, where it really, we understand that the focus will actually benefit the process and not actually detract from the efficiency.
Yeah. Thanks for that. The FDA ended its enforcement discretion period for certain regenerative medicine products on May 31st, a kind of end that was long forecast and foreshadowed. Did the discretion period have the results you had hoped, and how do you see the state of affairs now with the discretion period having ended?
Yeah, so I'd have to be honest, it didn't. The answer to that is a no. It did not have the intended what we would have liked to seen happen. What we would have liked to see happen is, over the course of 3 years, a variety of those entities that were working on products that were biologics in the true sense of the 351 biologic. That is, they are manufactured products being used in a manner in the recipient that's very different in whatever donor they came from, or the cells originated from. And what we've seen is, instead, we saw kind of what I would call a cat and mouse game, where people just kept they keep skipping from one thing to another. That's what they kept doing during that period. We saw things move from mesenchymal derived stem cells to amniotic derived stem cells to exosomes, and it's been kind of a flipping from one thing to the other. That's not to say that there aren't very legitimate areas of research in each of those, but a lot of non-legitimate stuff. So I'd say that there were a minority of sponsors who undertook the studies just as we wanted them to, and they are to be tremendously commended for doing so, and I'm very grateful for those. But unfortunately, it was nowhere near what we had hoped. And that leaves us with a situation where there are still many entities that are out there. And you're aware that we prevailed in an appellate case in one of our two major court cases going on. We're still waiting for the outcome of another, and I can't speak any more about that. But I think it may be that some are waiting to see what happens there before they take their action. But that to me is a little, again, makes me a little sad, because nobody is trying to say that you shouldn't develop a product. And we're here to help with the IND process to the greatest extent possible. But we do need to make sure products that are sold have safety and effectiveness. I mean, that's just the nature of where we've come as a country. We shouldn't be having products that people take just on faith are going to be working.
Right. You and the CBER leadership have been working without a permanent FDA commissioner now for 8 months, although obviously working with a talented colleague you've worked well with for a long time. Has not having a permanent commissioner, though, had any impact on CBER's work? And do you think a permanent commissioner is going to be in place anytime soon?
You know what? Let me take the second part. I have no idea, okay, about whether we're going to get a permanent commissioner anytime soon. It's a matter of fact that Dr. Woodcock, I think that some action has to happen by November 16th because of the Vacancies Act. But that being said, Dr. Woodcock has been at the agency for over 3 decades, and she, during that time, has proven herself to be a remarkably capable manager, and she's been managing as if she's been commissioner. So it's unlike some previous actings who are afraid to actually do things. She doesn't appear to be at all afraid of doing things. And so from my perspective, I have not felt any different now than when we've had a commissioner in place. And I've had the support when I needed things from Dr. Woodcock, be it personnel, funding, or anything else, as if there were a permanent commissioner. So I don't have anything that I can say has been a major downside here. And she's been incredibly supportive of cell and gene therapy. So I don't have anything to say, except I hope, I do think from the standpoint of outside of the agency, it'll be nice to have this dealt with, but internally, it's not slowing us down.
How is the interaction going with other parts of HHS? Obviously, there's a lot of new people now that would come in with the new administration. There's a big beefing up of the life sciences team at OSTP. You and I have talked in the past about just one of the important things is kind of getting the NIH and the FDA and HHS and other parts of the government working well together. How's that going?
Yeah, I think what I've seen is we continually are improving things here. I think we have good dialogue that's going on. And I think that goes between CDC and FDA, FDA and NIH, and the various agencies together. I think, ultimately, like any relationship, there are ups and downs, but I think we're all kind of settling into the knowledge that from the standpoint of the general public, if we don't have our acts together and we're not all essentially singing from the same hymnal, it's a problem. And so I think that doesn't mean that we don't sometimes have differences, but it means we just have to resolve them together, but through conversations. And actually, that's a good thing, because those discussions sometimes bring to light important issues that, as they're resolved, actually ultimately lead to a better outcome for public health. So, I'm optimistic that we'll continue to have improvement in this over the, over the coming months and years. I think it is hard. Transitions, that's the hard part. Transitions are challenging, but I think we're kind of starting to get to a good equilibrium with improvement.
Good. ARM recently put out one of its regular reports on the status of the field, and we chronicled kind of the first half of the sector. And as I know you're aware, it has really been a remarkable half year in terms of funding for regenerative medicine. And we're just blowing away all the previous records with more than $14 billion coming into the sector in the first half of the year alone. Big investments in immuno-oncology, gene therapy, just really across the board, across lots of different technologies and lots of different indications. We're also kind of anticipating that this could be a year of record-breaking approvals, though of course that remains to be seen, but we're on a good pace. But I think it's fair to say, although the pipeline is very full and this investment, adds fuel to the tank, that we haven't had products come to market at quite the pace we had originally anticipated. And there's a very oft quoted prediction from the agency about an anticipation that you would see 10 to 20 approvals per year in this space by 2025. Does that still feel right to you?
Yeah, I'm hoping we're going to get close to that. We may be at the lower end. It's really a little bit hard to know, because when you're kind of on this place where you kind of think you're at the beginning of the steep part of the inflection of things upward, hard to know. And remember, pandemic did slow us down a little bit. I mean, it, without a doubt, despite the fact that it's fantastic that so much capital is going in here, the past 2 years did slow us down from where we would have been. I think probably some of the work with bespoke gene therapies would have been at least a year ahead of where it was. And any number of gene therapy companies probably, although they didn't stop operations, they slowed down during that time. So, I'm optimistic. Do I know? I don't know. If I had to guess, it's probably going to be on the lower end. It may take a year or two later to get to that sweet spot where we were hoping for, but we'll just have to see.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us and share your perspectives with the attendees of the meeting on the Mesa. We're sorry you aren't able to join us in person this year, but we'll look forward to that opportunity in the future. Thanks again for all you're doing for cell and gene therapy, as well as for the fight against the pandemic. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me today.
Take care.